I am heavy
bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner
resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
I watched Macbeth last night.
Yeah, the witches was the best part.
Yeah. As I was watching it the whole time, I was like, man, I always confuse Macbeth with all the other plays. Like, it just gets jumbled up in my head. And I think it's because Macbeth isn't one of my favorite ones anyway.
I think it's the one I've had to read the most times.
I've had to
No,
read...
maybe not. I think I've probably only read it once, really.
I think I've only read it once in that Shakespeare class in undergrad.
Yeah, well, you took tragedies, I took comedies.
Yeah. And then I had probably Hamlet's the one I've had to read like 5 times.
Still never read it.
From like high school to through college. And in grad school, man, I took a Shakespeare class in grad school. I had to read it again. Maybe I don't know. I don't remember it, but yeah, I guess I need to reread all of those.
I had to get like a footstool. For some reason, I just like want to have my legs up higher, like a squatty potty.
Some old lady shit.
Yeah. I'm short.
Squatty potty, dude. If we get a sponsorship, Squatty potty, now we're talking.
Yeah, I don't feel like I need a squatty potty.
I mean, me neither, but
just get who actually needs that? Like, just use a yoga block if you have one.
Yeah, dude, see, giving out practical advice, dude. I think mostly elderly need that.
Some people would find that disgusting. Be like, use your yoga block for that.
Right.
Yeah, bitch. Like with all this shit that I keep on the floor and like sweat on, and like there's no sanitizing these blocks, dude.
Yeah, there's like $20 foam things. Like, yeah.
I mean, it's worse with mine. They're cork.
Oh, it is worse, yeah. But I guess they're both just as porous, so they just like let bacteria hide in there.
Yeah, sure.
Those porous materials.
Goddamn.
Porous fucking materials. What is this? Episode 9?
I don't know.
Damn, dude, 9 episodes.
Depends on if we cut any out.
Yeah. Should be good.
Some of those stinkers.
Fucking Virginia Woolf.
Yeah. She's good. Really good.
Very good, yeah.
My God, first book that I've read in a while. I mean, I've already read this book. But, man, there's something that's so good about a book that you just read and you're like, oh shit, yeah, that's a book about life.
Yeah, it's one of my questions. We'll get to that. But yeah, Virginia Woolf, pretty fucking famous. Most people know, or at least recognize the name. If you've never read any of her books, you probably had to read some in high school, or you pretended to in high school. That's usually the norm, right? Pretending to read it in high school.
I couldn't have read this in high school. I was too stupid, and I really had terrible reading comprehension.
It's interesting you say that, because I had to read... The only other thing I've read of Woolf is Mrs. Dalloway, and I had to read that in undergrad for like a 200 level survey course. And I remember hating that when I read it in like my early 20s. But I'd be very interested to go back and reread it now. Because like you just said, like I don't think I'd be able to read this To the Lighthouse without being a little bit older. And it's not even like we're fucking old. Like, I guess by some standards we are. But
I mean, I did not have the attention for those long ass sentences.
sentences, but I think it's more too. Like she's
But it's also
getting
so like intense and heavy and
right. She's getting at something like that. I don't think you can fully comprehend. Maybe you can, but I would say most people probably can't fully comprehend what she's actually trying to talk about in these things without having some life experience. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
I mean, yeah, it does.
Because, yeah, I could see myself reading this as like a 20 something in undergrad, just being like dismissive. Like, fuck this, it's boring. Like,
No, I think 20 something's old enough. I think, I read this in my early 20s
oh, you've already
and I
read this?
loved it. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. Read this in my early 20s. I read this for,
Okay, yeah. I guess we'll blur that name out, but
yeah. Well, I
yeah,
mean, I assume we'll blur out all of this, you know, side chatter. It's not interesting.
depends if it's good or not, man.
Bitch,
Uh,
it's,
yeah, that's actually for that same teacher. We didn't take the class together when we were in undergrad together, but I took a same class. But
different
obviously,
class.
obviously the teacher changes up the readings too. So it's I that's where the class I had to read Mrs. Dalloway at. It's the same
Yeah, I mean,
teacher
we both read Virginia Woolf in undergrad for the same professor, but for different classes.
and
And
different
yeah,
books too. I mean, I
different
never
books.
yeah. It's my first time
Um,
reading to the Lighthouse.
yeah, I actually pulled out my notes from that.
I guess this is considered her masterpiece.
I mean, wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I think so. I think, you know, people might say the same of Mrs. Dalloway, um, but yeah, this is fucking beautiful.
Fucking Virginia Woolf. Yeah. So Virginia Woolf, if you don't know Virginia Woolf, 20th century authors, she's considered probably one of the most important, if not the most important, like kind of modernist. She's British, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, and I would say easily like she didn't write that many novels, but I actually did look this up. So To the Lighthouse was published in 1927 originally, and then it's basically just been like an instant classic ever since. Uh, But yeah, we don't want to get too into her personal life. Although people love to talk about biography with authors, that could be something interesting to go into. The obsession with Virginia Woolf's biography. I guess this is true for a lot of writers, but
Well, it's true for the most loved writers.
uh,
And she was such like a big figure in like the sort of modernist, like British modernist literary circle.
yeah, I guess they call this her most autobiographical novel.
Do they? I don't know.
That's what it says on the back of mine.
Yeah.
I guess we read different versions. I read the Wordsworth Classics edition, so that's nice and cheap on Amazon. I think it's like $5, published in '94, and then I think reissued in 2002. But it's good, unabridged text. Introduction that I was bored to death, so I stopped reading by Nicola Bradbury. Uh, which version did you read, so?
I have the Harcourt books. Yeah, it's the copy I got in school.
All right, so the page numbers be a little different, but it's a pretty short book.
Yeah, I mean my copy is only 208 pages.
Yours is 208. Damn, mine's like 150, 160, not even.
Yeah, my copy is probably a little bit nicer. It probably has slightly bigger text.
Yeah, this is and those that don't know, the Wordsworth editions are like trying to make the classics. Like the whole point of it is to make it cheap and affordable. I guess they say for students and stuff too, but we'll link both copies in the description. You can buy whichever one you want as we continue to encourage everyone to add these books to their library. Because otherwise, what the fuck are you doing? I guess you could rent it from a public library, but buy a $5 copy. Fucking mark it up. Underline some of these great lines. Fucking read. Read the goddamn book. But yeah, alright, so those are the two versions. Fucking Virginia Woolf. Very, very big figure. And where do we start? We'll just start initial thoughts as usual. And then I have a couple ideas of how you want to go through this. I mean, I always take notes as I go, so it's always so happens that my notes are in like chronological order with the text as I consume it. So that helps us to kind of just go through major points if we want to do that. But I always like to start with our thoughts, and we can talk about themes, because this is another book where the themes are very much abundant, fucking out the ass, themes all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, split into 3 sections, just to talk about structure for a minute. They're all pretty different, but all part of the same story. I love this book. It's not like a super easy read.
Speak on it, Seth.
But it's fucking gorgeous. I mean, it's really, really meditative, really, like heavily philosophical, but not in the obnoxious way, you know, not like talking about philosophers here, but just sort of the characters, and I would argue probably Wolf's personal philosophies on like life and what it, you know, or like the search for meaning in life. And I think approaches that question of meaning while very broadly, like very sort of, I mean, it's just kind of badass. Because it's so huge and so large, and it's sort of like you get like so much of this book is like a snippet of time. It's just like a day.
Yeah, the bulk, I guess, what, book one or part one? Is
Part one, which I would say is like the first half of the book at least.
Yeah, definitely carries the most weight in terms of the other two sections, and then like, yeah, that's all one day basically. The part one is like one day, and then we jump 10 years in part two.
And for having so many characters, like I felt invested. I mean, not so many characters that it's like, holy shit, how do you keep track of these? It's not like Game of Thrones level,
Right.
you know? But like so many names that float past you that like accumulate meaning for you over time within a relatively like short number of pages, right? Like Mrs. Ramsey is like such a good character. Lily Bosco is such a good character. Mr. Ramsey is a great sort of tragic character.
Yeah.
Sort of tragic, not entirely.
I would say all of them essentially, even when we get like James towards the end. uh I'm just thinking this now, but like, I guess this is well known, like her influence on other people. But as reading these novels, like when you read the Virginia Woolf novels, I mean, she clearly set the tone for like literary novels for like the last 100 years.
I mean, well, like you get that really intense like stream of consciousness, but without being obnoxious in the same way that we see in a lot of contemporary novels where it's very like it's overly self-reflexive and overly, you know, sort of self-involved in an uninteresting way.
Yeah.
I think like Virginia Woolf's character is like where that happens, it's so addressed and like talking about sort of the self-reflexivity of the characters in a way that is actually quite critical. And I think that was really interesting. I'm also just generally a sucker for that style when it's done really well and seeing the movement of the mind, but like in a way that is rhythmic and really makes sense and isn't just sort of folding in all of these like random kind of sexy ideas, you know, just for the sexiness of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's gorgeous. I like the prose is unreal. It's gorgeous. It's like fucking actually very beautiful. It puts poets to shame.
Yeah. I noticed that. I was just thinking, like, this. Obviously, she's known for the stream of consciousness. For those that don't know, listeners, that's her big thing. And basically, she does it better than anybody before her and pretty much anybody since, dude. I mean, I can't think of anybody that does this stream of consciousness kind of style as good or better than she did.
Yeah, and there are other like small things like I mean the way that she shifts perspective so often without warning,
Right.
right? She'll just sort of float from one character perspective right into the next. You know, one character might be thinking about another character and you might be getting that perspective and then we slip over into the other character's perspective and like it works really well and often we'll get a a train of thought from one character for a long time and then the next character will sort of pick up on the same thought. And it's just really well done and really convincingly done.
Yeah.
And also like felt really honest. Like these characters felt very, very honest.
That's an interesting word to use. I don't know if we want to get into it, but I'm always thinking, like, you know, you hear people say this all the time. It's like, well, it's honest.
Well, they had a lot of depth in a way that
Right.
felt true.
Right.
But
So,
I think that's a lot of what this book was trying to address.
yeah.
It's like the nature of being a person and by, you know, just by virtue of being human, being sort of private.
I was thinking while reading this book, dude, I kept going back to our episode on Joy Williams, The Quick and the Dead.
I mean, she feels like someone who would be very heavily influenced by modernist literature.
Right. It made me kind of understand what Williams was trying to do with that stuff.
I feel like that's a lot of what we see when we see what comes out. I mean, I feel that way about everything, though. I would say that about like modernism, but then I would also say that I'm actually more drawn to those books than I am to the ones that are more born out of like, you know, if we were to talk about like confessional poetry. But yeah, I don't know. There's something that also just feels really not nearly as sincere and that and the quick and the dead as like those characters don't feel anywhere as sincere or as deep or as like true to life. Like they don't feel like they're living and breathing as honestly as these characters are.
There's that word again. Yeah, I think more it's just style. I was noticing more that like, oh, okay, you know, obviously Woolf is one of the biggest influences in literature ever, so of course people are influenced by her style and all this stuff, trying to copy, trying to improve whatever it is. Try to attempt to create something on the same level. I mean, that's all we're doing, right? I mean, those people while writing. But yeah, our initial thoughts are we liked it. I liked it.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, it was pretty fucking great. And honestly, I was telling Sophie this, I was not thrilled. Like, we have our list set up and we go through this list. So a reminder to listeners too, if you requested something, we've taken note, but our list is long and it may take us years to get to the books you want us to. But yeah, I was like, oh man, you know, this high-minded literary thing. I wasn't thrilled. And then I just sat down with it and was enthralled. Absolutely enthralled. Uh, just completely hypnotized. Like I was like hypnotized by the book as you're reading through it. Yeah, it was good. It was up there. It's one of the best ones we've read so far, so we've only done 9 books for this. Did you have introduction in your version?
Oh yeah, I didn't read it.
I
It's by mine is Eudora Welty though.
Ooh, nice. I saw that version. I thought about buying it. I was like, all right, Eudora Welty. But yeah, mine was so boring. I only read like 3 pages of it. That happens with introductions. It depends who writes it. So if you have like another writer doing an introduction, it's usually a much more personal and like fan style introduction where they talk about what the work means to them and then maybe overall to like the field of literature. And then when you get like an academic doing the introduction, dude, it is so academic. It's like it's impossible to read. It's just like, oh my god. You guys just don't know how to write like a funny, pleasing introduction. Yeah, at least that's been my experience with it. But anyway, yeah.
Eudora seems fairly to the point and fairly brief, not obnoxious.
Yeah. Well, I like that was Eudora's style, dude. I like Eudora, and I like that she was one who was very open to like pop fiction as well. Like she loved crime fiction and shit, and she would openly say we should be talking more about these types of novels. And
Do you have her collected stories?
Eudora?
I have her. Yeah, I have her
No.
collected short stories. I keep meaning to read that, but it's thick as fuck.
Add to the list. Add to the list. But yeah, all right. So we talked about that. We both really enjoyed this book. It's great. Pick up a cheap copy and put it on your shelf. Pretend to read it if you want, but we suggest you read it. We've already said some of these. Do you want to start with themes, or do you want to go off of mention the sentences? We already mentioned how grand and beautiful they are. Dense.
They are dense and winding and long, but not always. Like there are moments where you get like these really brief sentences that she uses to like punctuate these longer, windier thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, that is fucking I noticed that too, and I noticed this in modernist texts anyway. So when I read modernist authors, if they're good, they were using every fucking structure that they could in like composing these sentences. I was thinking her use of parenthetical, which is one of my questions about. I was thinking of like, and it made me think of like Faulkner's use of parenthetical. Like they really just like use it to their full advantage. Like all the grammatical things you could do, all the structural things you could do. And we're talking just sentence wise, not necessarily plot wise, but like sentence wise is used to the full advantage. And it's like, yeah, just beautiful, beautifully composed shit.
Yeah, just really, really attentive to language.
Yeah. But yeah, man, do you want to start with themes? I mean, we could go on themes. There's a lot of shit in this.
Well, do you want to sort of summarize what's happening in this first bit? Like in these first several chapters. So in this first, in the first section at the beginning, it sort of opens with Mrs. Ramsey and her son, one of her sons, I think her youngest son, right? James.
It's James. James is her favorite, yeah.
Um,
And there's 8 kids. You learn all that shit. This kind of, I guess you'd call it upper middle class family in England.
yeah. And James wants to go to the Lighthouse. And Mrs. Ramsey is saying, well, if it's good out tomorrow, basically. And then Mr. Ramsey keeps coming in being like, it won't be fine tomorrow. We can't go to the Lighthouse. And she keeps being all pissed off that he's being so intense about it. And that keeps coming back throughout this section. And like I said, the section, takes course over one day. So from the beginning of this section to the end of this section is the same day, right? So will they, won't they go to the lighthouse?
Yeah, and that's weird because it's like to set up a plot for this. Like, I guess that is the plot, but it's not actually like.
Yeah. Well, and there are all these people that are like, you know, at their vacation home, I guess, right? And they have all these people joining them. And what, they have like 8 kids.
8 kids, bunch of guests come to their house. I guess this is their summer house, right? And it's like on
Yeah.
like the shores of somewhere in England, and
Yeah.
they come there for the summer, blah blah. And then there's on top of that, there's like housekeepers and stuff that pop in and out, and there's a lot. Yeah,
Yeah. And like friends of the family and shit that
right.
are just there that we hear a lot of criticism about. Yeah,
Yeah, I would
and
say
so, yeah, go ahead.
lots of shots at academics,
Lots of shots at academics.
particularly when they're taught. When I think when Wolf's describing or writing here about Mr. Ramsey, who his job is he's a professor of like philosophy or something, right? Like a tenured professor somewhere, and he's constantly worrying about not just his reputation but his work and all that kind of stuff. And
Or how famous he is. There's a
yeah,
lot of concern for how famous any one of them is.
well, really just Ramsey, Mr. Ramsey, I guess.
Yeah, and well, there's um
Lily, maybe.
no, the poet.
Tansley? Was it? No.
No. Well, Tansley also, he seemed like someone who had a lot of care for that. But the one who didn't seem to care quite as much about it,
Right.
Carmichael, who was like, he was like the opium addict one, right?
Yeah, like the old guy that just kind of lumbers around,
Oh,
like falls
yeah.
asleep in chairs with like poetry books open on his lap.
Oh, yeah. And everyone kind of just makes fun of him.
Yeah, typical poet, you know. Yeah,
Um, yeah, but a lot of criticism of like of frustration. I mean, we get mostly the internal thoughts of characters. I feel like, most of it isn't just like dialogue.
I was gonna ask a question about that too. That's one of my questions: is the use of dialogue in this novel, especially because what I kept noticing is that the dialogue obviously is very sparse. That's part of her style, but it's only sparse if you look at it in like the traditional kind of dialogue setup with like the brackets, the quotations around the speech, so and so said. She still has the say, like she kind of describes the conversation instead of
Yeah.
giving us the actual conversation.
Well, she gives us the internal monologue version of the conversation, right?
Interspersed with things where I think, like, I just mean like she'll just straight up say, like, there'll be some dialogue, but then it'll go into like like inner monologue type thing, but then it'll be like he said aloud, and then it's
Yeah.
not quotations or
But
anything. It isn't
definitely has to
differentiated.
distinguish between said aloud and thought. Like there were
Yeah.
definitely moments where there was something distinguishing between someone imagining conversation and someone actually saying something out loud. Um,
Yeah, and I kept noticing this kind of, and it's a cliche in writers' rooms, workshops, programs, whatever. We're like, oh, show don't tell. I think Wolf says "fuck you" to a lot of that, because she's telling us a lot, and I noticed this specifically with the dialogue. It's like she's telling us the dialogue, but she's not showing us the conversation in like the kind of typical kind of dialogue form. And my question was just like, yeah, how is this used? Is it an advantage to the text, a weakness?
well, I think the goal of the text isn't to show us the exact image of how they interact with one another, but how their minds interact with what is going on.
Right.
So I don't know if the whole show don't tell even actually applies, because it's like she is showing us the insides of her characters' minds, even when, like, I in ways that I think are very different from just like having an objective narrator telling you such and such is happening. And they're filled with scenes too. Like
Right.
the inner monologue is like there are still things happening.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. It's a weird one.
Well, I would say this is genius level using that type of rule breaking. Not even rule breaking, like you're saying. It's not quite that show versus tell thing, but it's like I think it's genius level using that type of technique uh, to pull the reader through. Yeah, I thought it's kind. I guess it's what she's known for. I mean, this is like her huge innovation in literature was her stream of consciousness type thing, where there's the
Well, and it's
repressed.
so concerned with the inner lives of characters. So much like it was so much more focused on that than on what characters might be saying to each other, but what they weren't saying to each other. But like what they were thinking about each other, what they had maybe wanted to say to one another but didn't. Like, and that made them that much realer, I think.
Yeah,
I think it is almost like, I don't know, maybe it's easier also to show the mind. I mean, it's a lot more work in some ways, but maybe more naturally easy to write the mind than to write
oh yeah,
like really scripted, but like dialogue with the sense that it's really real, like that it would really happen.
right. Yeah, and I guess there's endless arguments over that, but yeah, I would just say it's definitely an advantage in her style, and I think the way she uses it is straight up genius level. Like there's every once in a while you get a writer that does shit like this, and she's definitely one of those figures. Again, this is well known, right? It's not like we're like, oh, this is our opinion. I mean, this is literally like the consensus of the literary world. But yeah, man, I was thinking like themes and shit like that. Like, there's a lot, but I guess you always come back to, and I see a lot of writing about this that I passively glanced at, and just like the marriage themes, because it's marriage is definitely a theme, but it's much deeper than just like marriage. It is about being newlywed, puppy love versus being married for decades versus being married for 10 years. I mean, all this kind of like and all that's different. Like it's all different. And I think that's why people love Woolf so much is she does manage to capture these subtle dynamics that can only happen.
Well, and also just some of the basic stuff of men and women
Yeah, that's a huge. I think she's brilliant
and
at
what
that.
they think of each other.
Absolutely brilliant. I was blown away, yeah, by that kind of the theme of like the male versus female.
But also like the celebration of ordinary life
Yeah,
and of like, you know, like being mostly a housewife, or like taking joy in like these. I mean, and maybe that could be argued, but like some of it is like, and there
yeah,
are characters that push back on it, but like there is that celebration, I think, of um I don't know, what would you call it? Like domestic life.
yeah. I mean, they call it domesticity, and I've seen a lot of from what I've again passively glanced at some scholarship and writings on this. Yeah, that's all about that. The domesticity aspect, the everyday doing laundry, mending stockings, making sure the fires are lit, all just groundskeeping, making sandwiches for make sure your 8 kids get fed. Like,
And well, and like the life of the home
yeah,
as like this like space to be filled with life all the time and to like fill with joy and like yeah, but definitely you know, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey paint a very interesting picture of like a sort of the central, I guess, couple, or like the people around which everything sort of happens,
Again,
right?
going back, I don't think if I was unmarried, if I have never experienced marriage and like what it is, I don't think this book would have had as big an impact on me. Like again, if I was like a 20 something who doesn't know what the fuck marriage is, only has like vague inklings from like pop culture and novels, I just don't
Well,
think it would have hit as hard.
I agree, but also it still did for me, I think. But it's funny because I'll read back and I'll see notes I took where I like Lily Bosco, who is like this artist who is always described with as having small Chinese eyes. Like that's
Oh
just
shit, here
we
we
have
go.
to I mean we have to say so. It
Yeah, dude.
happened and it happens a lot. So just
Oh
like, you
shit.
know, okay, like know that that happens.
Oh
All
shit.
right? And it happens frequently. All right.
Oh yeah.
Uh but you know,
And
that
this,
is not most of the novel by
yeah,
far. And like is but she is like this painter, and she's also like one of, I would say, you know, if we have Mrs. Ramsey on one end as being one central character, and even, you know, Mr. Ramsey, I would say, plays a lesser role.
we're
There's
not
also
in
Lily
his head as
Bosco, this
much.
artist.
Yeah,
He's a big deal. He is like
right,
very important in the novel, but I wouldn't say that he is a central character. We are definitely not in his head as much as we are in Lily's. And
right.
I see them as being like the two counterparts in which I would expect Woolf kind of sees herself in both.
Okay.
That's my guess.
Before we get to Lily, because I do want to talk about Lily's dynamic and what she does in this book, just before we move off the last topic here about marriage, and this is also an example I have of her dialogue use. So she's not doing structured dialogue, but she says, this is on page 49 in my version. It's chapter 12 of the first book, you know, of part one. And it's at the end of the second very long paragraph at the beginning of this chapter, chapter 12. For the Wordsworth edition, it's page 49. So here it is when they're talking. It's between Mr. Ramsey and Mrs. Ramsey, and they're talking about their son Andrew, who I believe is their eldest son, and he's like trying to be like a scholar or whatever, and following his father's footsteps a little bit. And we later learn in the novel that, you know, he's goes off to war and dies in World War One, right?
Two,
World War Two.
right?
Well, I would say World War Two didn't happen yet when this novel was written, so definitely World War One.
Wait, what do I have written here? Hang on. I feel like that was a note that I had in here. You've got to be right.
Yeah, this book came out in 27, so it definitely wasn't about World War One. I mean World War Two. Anyway, the whole point of that is just, so here's an example of them talking, right? About their son Andrew, about him trying to get a scholarship so he can move on, you know, be a scholar, blah blah. It says he should be very proud of Andrew if he got a scholarship, comma, he said. And that's completely, you know, so she's giving us the dialogue, just not in structure. Then Miss Ramsey says she would be just as proud of him if he didn't, she answered. And then we get the kind of thing about both their heads. So they disagreed always about this, but it did not matter. She liked him to believe in scholarships, and he liked her to be proud of Andrew, whatever he did. And I'm just like, yeah, like this is one of the perfect dynamics of marriage happening, like the marriage dynamics happening in the text right here. Like, they disagreed always about this, but it did not matter. She liked him to believe in scholarships, and he liked her to be proud of Andrew, whatever he did. And it's this kind of means to an end, but yeah. So that's just why I pulled that out. So it gives the example of the dialogue I'm talking about. Like, there is dialogue. It's just kind of like very much subtle and embedded in the longer kind of inner monologue musings, and then you all of a sudden you get straight up he said, she answered, these kind of things, but it's not set off like regular dialogue, and it works brilliantly. That's what I mean. Like, the genius level of using this technique is very apparent. But yeah, anyway, yeah, that's the only point I wanted to make. If you're looking for like an actual example. But when you were talking about Lily, my question about Lily, yeah, is what is Lily's purpose in the novel? And you were just getting to it, and I interrupted you before we moved on. But I said she's almost the opposite of Miss Ramsey,
Yeah, I think she's her like her foil in some ways.
and I
Right?
think
Like
in
she's yeah, go on.
specifically the judgment that she, not that she says out loud, but that she thinks about Lily, the Lily character, about Miss Ramsey.
Yeah. Well, and also well, right, and that judgment wasn't overtly stated at first, but sort of comes about later on as like this thing, like this idea that Mrs. Ramsey always gets what she wants. She, has this way of willing things. And she has this idea that like Mrs. Ramsey must hold some like she must have some secret knowledge, right? Even
Right.
though she disagrees and like laughs when Mrs. Ramsey is always telling her that, oh, you must marry, like you must have, you're missing, you have no, basically that you can't access the best parts of life if you don't marry, which,
Back then was probably true for a woman.
and also Mrs. Ramsey kind of goes on to sort of be very honest about her marriage and like her frustrations with her husband and all of this. And people see that, but they also see this incredible beauty in Mrs. Ramsey.
Yeah,
Like they're all very taken with her and sort of love her. And even Lily Bosco kind of loves her and questions whether she loves Mrs. Ramsey, but then says, no, it's all this that I love. It's
that
like,
I think.
this place. And so like this sort of like housemaking and this sort of sense of comfort and of always having, you know, like people and like just something happening around
Well,
you.
I could argue that the biggest change in terms of like character change that you kind of expect in a traditional novel form is Lily, because Lily is most of that last section, her perspective and her kind of reflection as she sits there staring at her easel, kind of trying to paint. And like, because Mr. Ramsey doesn't really, and I would say James as well, because James is only mentioned briefly in the first section because he's very young, and then we jump 10 years and he's 17, so he's like 7 in the first section, and they talk briefly mention that he hates his father, and
Yeah,
then
well, they
at the end,
briefly at the very beginning, she like you get this wonderful moment of Mrs. Ramsey. So Mr. Ramsey is being all like severe and intense and like, he's described as being like a scholar who's like pacing around and sort of living in his own world and is obsessed with like, philosophy. And it seems that like Mrs. Ramsey too has her own space for that, but is more like meditative and loves to sort of separate herself from the world in these quiet moments.
yeah,
But she gets all they're always describing Mr. Ramsey as bearing down, right? He's bearing down on her at this moment, like in this, exchange or something. And those words keep being used. And in this moment, Mr. Ramsey says, no, we are not going to the lighthouse tomorrow. He says it again, so it keeps coming up.
that's going
And
back.
then Mrs. Ramsey thinks about James and says, yep, he'll remember this moment for the rest of his life. And she says it not knowing that it's true, it seems like, but
Also knowing that
um,
it's true, like,
also like,
yeah,
yeah, it's
it's
she like,
brilliant, it's very human, it's a very hard thing to capture, particularly
and
in
then
writing.
we have James later, much later in the last section of the novel, hearing those words that like, about them not going to the lighthouse.
Going back to your point about Miss Ramsey and her beauty, right? I mean, I think I correct me if I'm misremembering this, but I think right away we get that, like in chapter 1 of the first section, that Tansley is basically in his inner monologue admitting to us that he kind of loves Miss Ramsey, like he's kind of in love with her.
Yeah, I think a lot of the men are. And,
Right.
and we
Yeah.
get that also with William Banks,
Yeah.
but through Lily.
Right. So Lily, and here's where I was thinking the section with Lily. So we were talking about Lily, kind of what is she serving this novel, kind of like not so much opposite, but kind of opposite of Mrs. Ramsey. And this quote is in my version, page 62. It's in chapter 17 of the first section, where they're at the table, I think, and it's through Lily's inner monologue perspective, but then of course we go in and out of this, so we hear what's actually happening around the table while also going in and out of Lily's stream of consciousness. So we say, In page 62 here towards the top, it says, "Do you write many letters, Mr. Tansley?" asked Miss Ramsay, pitying him too, Lily supposed. For that was true of Miss Ramsay. She'd pitied men always as if they lacked something. Women never, as if they had something.
Yeah.
So we get this Lily is very judgmental of Mrs. Ramsay, and we don't, and even Lily doesn't quite know why. Or I guess she does. Maybe she just tried to explain it to us there, right? Pitied men always as if they lacked something. Women never, as if they had something.
Yeah, I mean, she's so good. Like, she is good. I mean, we like all of, like, in all of her moments. So, like, in that dinner scene, she's so acutely aware of like what is going on with everybody at any given moment. Like, she just has like this, you're gonna hate this word, but she just has an intuition about everything.
No,
Right?
I
Everything
think
that's happening.
I think that intuition is what makes it so intriguing. I think that's a good word for it too, this intuition, but not just intuition. Like, this goes back to one of the male intuition versus female intuition. Read into that whatever you want, but I mean, again, it's one of these things that's incredibly difficult to capture.
But somehow, like, people see into that and have this like very visceral response to her. So there's this guy who's there for dinner, right? What's his name? The guy who marries Minta Doyle.
I know who you're talking about, the one that Ramsay is obsessed with them marrying. Miss
Yeah.
Ramsay is obsessed with like getting them, like, kind of matchmaking them together.
Well, no, not even matchmaking them, right? She was like worried that it was going to happen, but she knew it was happening, right? And she like would watch them and think, "Yep, he's done it. He's doing it. It's happening now." And like it was, and then we go, and it is happening then. And then they're at the dinner, and she's like, "I know it. It's happened. Look at them. It's happened." And then like Lily can tell that there's something going on too. So she's also very sort of aware of things. But like, yeah,
So-
not as not as obviously, sort of, or like she doesn't know how to read it quite as easily. And but Peter also has this really visceral reaction to Mrs. Ramsay, like as though she had essentially told him to do it, as though she had given him permission to do it, just by sort of intuitively knowing what was happening. It seemed like they had, like, between Mrs. Ramsay and other people, there's always this like unspoken thing where she just understands what's happening, and they see that.
It's the subtle social things that you pick up on that are unsaid.
Yeah,
And then
it's
that's
like,
always, I think she's what she's best at. All of it. Like, I wrote down in my notes here, you're talking about chapter 17, right? Like that dinner scene. So I called it, in my
which is
version,
huge. It's a huge part of this book. It's
the
like
longest
maybe
chapter, I
it's
think.
this. I would sort of say like it's maybe like the central
It is, yeah.
event,
And
or
you feel it. You feel it as you're reading it. And like, in my version, it's pages 60 to page 80, roughly. Yeah, page 60 to page 80.
because it's the only time where all of these people are together and interacting, and we're sort of watching all of them through their internal monologue, except for the few whose minds we never see into, like Carmichael, or like some of the kids, or
That dinner scene, chapter 17 in book 1 or section 1, pages 60 to 80 in the Wordsworth edition I have. I wrote down in my notes, the dinner scene is absolutely great. It's long, but we get the, like, it's the absolute, like, masterclass in craft, particularly of her style. If you read nothing else in this book, just read chapter 17 of section 1, like those 20 pages. And you were already talking about it, like the way we bounce around the table, and everybody's inner monologue is interacting with everybody else's, but they don't know it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's just, and like the dialogue, she's using that same dialogue technique where there's a little bit of speech, and then she just tells us what they said instead of giving us the actual structured dialogue. Like, and it just bounces around, and it works. I was reminded of, like, when we did Wharton, House of Mirth. Like, it was witty. It was so fucking witty, and it was great. Like, it was, and it was a masterclass in her style, the way she uses that to a T. Like, just perfectly blends all of these different inner monologues seamlessly going from one to the other, and you feel like you're at that table, right? Like, you feel like you're in everybody's head, and they're all interacting. They don't even know it, but they do know it, because again, it's these unsaid little social cues that Woolf is a master at articulating in this type of form, in novel form like this. So yeah, I just had to say that because it's fucking great. Like, also at that dinner scene, I wrote down here is like, so we already talked about the theme of kind of like male, female, the forever kind of battle of the sexes type thing. I think that's another thing you see perfectly laid out, because you're jumping between all these characters' heads. You're jumping between the male perspective and the female perspective, how they're looking at one another, how they know how that person is looking at them type thing, right? Like, it's not like it's same thing in like social, like when somebody's admiring you, or like checking you out, like all, and it's like nothing is said, but you see the eyes, right? Like, you see the eyes, you see the way that they shift in their chair, like all this kind of shit that just clues you into what's happening, instead of giving us this long back and forth dialogue or something like that. And I just think it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I texted you right after reading that scene, just being like, my God. It was like the last thing I read on like one of my reading times when I was reading this book, and I ended up on that chapter. It's long, so I was like, all right, well, I'll finish this long chapter and then call it a day. And like, I was just enthralled. Like, I texted you right away. I was like, oh my God, dude, that dinner scene, holy shit. If I could write half as well as that, like, holy shit, dude. But yeah, I mean, what do you think? I mean, I don't want to just praise it. There were a couple of things I underlined in that chapter. The one I already read you about Lily's kind of Miss Ramsey. Just beautiful prose, man. I mean, just, there are things I just underlined because I thought they were brilliantly articulated, or they're just like absolutely great. One of the lines, her own poverty of spirit.
Yeah, I mean, so that idea that, this, I mean, so the dinner scene, I think, is also like a show between men and women, and it's where we start to get this sense of Mr. Ramsey. I mean, we already have this sense of him, but I think it kind of becomes developed, the sense of him as someone who must, like, he needs to sort of dominate in a situation. He needs people to submit to him, which later, much later on, sort of turns to like the need for sympathy, which is like almost put about, like, it comes about as allowing him to dominate a situation from the woman's side, which is really interesting. But I think, like, we get this sort of interaction. Well, it's not really an interaction. It's an observation from Mrs. Ramsey that, and this is from memory, I can't find the page, but that they were, well, first of all, in the first part of this novel, they keep talking about Shakespeare, right? Who really enjoys reading Shakespeare, and how long will Shakespeare be remembered anyway? And Mr. Ramsey seems kind of obsessed with this question, and is like reading some article in the paper about it or something.
Oh yeah.
Like, and was it him that's asserting that, most people who read it don't actually enjoy it anyway?
Heavy board.
They're just pretending to. Yeah.
Literature bores me, especially great literature. Yeah.
But meanwhile, like, and this is where it feels so full and it never ever one-sided, like, because Mrs. Ramsey is there also being like, and he's thinking of, he's sitting there like worrying about himself, like, and how, like, will he be forgotten, and like, will, like, because by this point, so like he has his book out, but it's been years now, and like, so that sort of flame has died out a little bit, and he's like, will I be remembered? And he's like, just obsessed with Shakespeare, and like he's seen through the eyes of Mrs. Ramsey as this sort of pitiful creature who sees the work of like the house and just sort of general silliness and like just playfulness is like a kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
And the men are sort of described that way. It's not just him either. I would say more subtly other characters. Maybe not so much Carmichael, the opium addict poet, who's just somewhere all the time and sort of openly asked for more soup, which disgusted Mr. Ramsay, I think. I think it was Mr. Ramsay. But like at the dinner, he asks for more soup, and Mr. Ramsay's all pissed about it. Or maybe it's Mrs. Ramsay knowing that Mr. Ramsay will be all pissed about it.
All right, I'm gonna highlight because this is one of the things I did from Banks right during that dinner scene, in chapter 17 of the part 1, where we're in. I think it's one of the few places we get Banks thing at that dinner, and he's sitting next to Miss Ramsay. And I think they kind of describe the table as, okay, it's very old school, kind of like, dining where, servants or housekeepers, whatever, footmen or whatever, are serving you. And they had, Mr. Ramsay's at one head of the table, Miss Ramsay's at the other. And then the guests are kind of scattered in between. But anyway, Banks is sitting next to her, and he's just asking himself at this point, as he's trying to keep up conversation, he's like, is human life this? Is human life that? One never had time to think about it. But here he was asking himself that sort of question, because Miss Ramsay was giving orders to servants, and also because it had struck him, thinking how surprised Miss Ramsay was that Carrie Manning should still exist, that friendships, even the best of them, are frail things. One drifts apart. He reproached himself again. He was sitting beside Miss Ramsay, and he had nothing in the world to say to her. "I'm so sorry," said Miss Ramsay, turning to him at last. He felt rigid and barren, like a pair of boots that has been soaked and gone dry, so that you can hardly force your feet into them. Yet he must force his feet into them. He must make himself talk. Unless he were very careful, she would find out this treachery of his, that he did not care a straw for her, and that would not be at all pleasant, he thought. So he bent his head courteously in her direction. And again, this is all interspersed with like little bits of dialogue. But yeah. Sorry, that was on page 65 in chapter 17 of my version.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where these moments are in my version.
Thinking how surprised Miss Ramsay was that Carrie Manning should still exist, that friendships, even the best of them, are frail things. That line alone made me underline this section, but then, yeah, just using it as this example of Banks is sitting next to Miss Ramsay, doesn't really like her, but he has to force himself to talk to her because they're sitting next to each other at this dinner.
Oh, yeah, I found it. Okay, it's page 89 in mine.
Nice. "How you must detest dining in this bare garden," she said, making use, as she did when she was distracted, of her social manner.
God, I forgot about that moment we get Mr. Banks.
It's like a very brief glimpse, too, and it's about just because he's one of the people sitting at the table. And, like,
yeah,
we're all sitting around a dinner party, or not even dinner parties. All these people are actually, like, staying at the house, right? Like the summer house. I guess that was a big thing back then when you were kind of wealthy, is you just had, like, artists and shit stay at your summer house with you for, like, months. Like a painter like Lily would just come and be like, "Oh, yes, I'd love to stay for free at your house and paint all day." Like, they would, "Oh, that would be lovely." Writers, all that kind of shit. Yeah, like, "Come write your novel here. Come finish it up."
Yeah. How trifling it all is. How boring it all is, he thought, compared with the other thing, work. He sat there drumming his fingers on the tablecloth when he might have been. He took a flashing bird's eye view of his work.
That Ramsay? Or
I think that's Mr. Banks.
Banks? Yeah, that long
What a waste
paragraph.
of time it was. What a waste of time it all was, to be sure. Yet, he thought, she is one of my oldest friends. Yet now at this moment, her presence meant absolutely nothing to him. Her beauty meant nothing to him.
Yeah.
The truth was that he did not enjoy family life. And like that seems to be sort of the theme with them, like with some of the men in the book, but also, yeah, this idea that men get like absorbed in work and the world of thoughts and like, causes external to family. and that like Mrs. Ramsey as the woman of this house like has this gift
Yeah,
of creating like moments for people, which is also something that recurs. But her biggest, I feel like her most sort of meditative moments come when they talk about the waves. The waves is like this recurring image that I guess describes thought.
dude, right there at the end of that same section there, I think this is about either Ramsey or Tansley. Of course, Ramsey had dished himself. I think, I don't know. But anyway, it's like he felt extremely, even physically, uncomfortable. He wanted somebody to give him a chance of asserting himself. He wanted it so urgently that he fidgeted in his chair, looked at this person, then at that person, tried to break into their talk, opened his mouth and shut it again. They were talking about the fishing industry. Why did no one ask him his opinion? What did they know about the fishing industry? Lily Briscoe knew all that. I think it was Tansley she's talking about, yeah. Because Tansley's the one Lily hates because he said women can't write or paint or whatever. So she, like, hates this guy.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really have to track it back that far
Yeah,
to
yeah.
find out whose thoughts you're thinking.
Yeah, it's funny because in that paragraph we start with Miss Ramsey,
Yeah.
and then halfway through that paragraph we move on to Mr. Banks interjecting, and then we switch to Tansley's point of view, like in the middle of the same sentence.
Yeah, well, Mrs. Ramsey at this dinner is sort of operating as like a kind of weird linchpin, you know?
Right.
Like everyone at whom she directs an interaction, we sort of get that person's internal monologue.
So I mean, and
So
it
she's
does.
like the transition.
But as you're reading it, you do follow along with like the progression, like the jumping from
Yeah,
here to there because you're kind of
it makes
across the
sense.
table. Yeah. And
But you do have to like the sentences are long and sometimes you do have to track back for a while if you're like there were paragraphs that I had to read and reread. And I still feel like I need to reread this book to fully get at it. It's one of those that has so much going on that you can read it and find something new every time.
yeah. Very. I mean, it's brilliant.
But yeah, so much of it's just really gorgeous. I think that Lily and Mrs. Ramsey are in a lot of ways the same. They both have the image of the waves whenever they're like they have moments of thought where we see the waves as kind of like a representation of being or of the way thoughts move.
Yeah. Yeah, Ben. I guess, do you want to move on from the dinner scene or?
Yeah.
Because that is like probably the most pivotal, at least the most enjoyable scene for the reader. Last thing I have for this before we go to book or section 2, the kind of going back to that dynamic of marriage, and I have this long chunk on page 89 blocked off. It's literally the last section, the last couple paragraphs before we get to part 2. So the last couple paragraphs of part 1 here. Really the last time we see Miss Ramsey, because we find out that she died in the beginning of part 2. But yeah, when Rannister and Mrs. Ramsey are kind of alone, this is after the dinner, and I guess they're kind of sitting around, and he just says, "You won't finish that stocking tonight," he said, pointing to her stocking. That was what she wanted, the asperity in his voice reproving her. If he says it's wrong to be pessimistic, probably it is wrong, she thought. The marriage will turn out all right. No, she said, flattening the stocking out upon her knee. I shan't finish it. And what then? For she felt that he was still looking at her, but that his look had changed. He wanted something. One of the things she always found it so difficult to give him. Wanted her to tell him that she loved him, and that, no, she could not do. He found talking so much easier than she did. He could say things. She never could. So naturally it was always he that said the things, and then for some reason he would mind this suddenly and would reproach her. A heartless woman, he called her. She never told him that she loved him. But it was not so. It was not so. It was only that she never could say what she felt. Was there no crumb on his coat? Nothing she could do for him? Getting up, she stood at the window with the reddish-brown stocking in her hands, partly to turn away from him, partly because she did not mind looking now, with him watching, at the lighthouse. For she knew that he had turned his head as she turned. He was watching her. She knew that he was thinking, You are more beautiful than ever. And she felt herself very beautiful. Will you not tell me just for once that you love me? He was thinking that, for he was roused. What with Minta and his book, and its being the end of the day, and their having quarreled about going to the lighthouse. But she could not do it. She could not say it. Then, knowing that he was watching her, instead of saying anything, she turned, holding her stocking, and looked at him. And as she looked at him, she began to smile, for though she had not said a word, he knew, of course he knew, that she loved him. He could not deny it, and smiling she looked out the window and said, thinking to herself, nothing on earth can equal this happiness. Yes, you were right. It's going to be wet tomorrow. She had not said it, but he knew it. And she looked at him smiling, for she had triumphed again.
It's good shit.
Oh my god, dude, like it's absolutely beautiful. Like it's absolutely incredible. Like and like so I mean the marriage, the dynamic of marriage, the unsaid, yes, you were right, it's going to be wet tomorrow. She had not said it, but he knew it. Yeah. And I think it is this level of, again, you're talking about like the dynamic between the sexes in that sense, and then there's like the unsaid said, right? Like she couldn't say she loved him, but couldn't she do something for him to say it, right? Fix his coat, brush a crumb off, make sure, I mean, you know.
Well, she also, I mean, I would say one thing that is like a very big difference, I think, between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay and maybe the dynamic of men and women at the time was that there's a sense, and this is commented on throughout the novel, I think, there are these moments that I already talked about that are like meditative, and often it has to do with the waves and like separating from your sort of sense of self, right? But like this, that you sort of give up having your own real personality, or she like that she's sort of given up her own sort of idiosyncrasies in many ways, or whatever would give her like, you know, distinct personality maybe, or she's not entirely herself, right? She's like this social thing, as opposed to men who like, you know, we get Mr. Ramsay who just sort of paces about and just thinks on end like all the time, and that maybe there's like a sense of freedom in that ability to just live in your mind all the time and not have to do all the things for all the people, and men seem to take issue with this in the novel.
Yeah, that's the thing too. Yeah, the dynamics between 100 years ago and now too, with that, it's definitely different. But I would say she definitely, I mean, the whole thing ends with, for she had triumphed again.
Yeah. So it's not like a powerlessness.
That's what I mean. Yeah. It's not powerless. Yeah. It's a different type of.
Well, yeah, and I think that's acknowledged too all the way through, especially with Lily, and like toward the end, the interactions between Lily and Mr. Ramsay. But we will get there. But the very next section is called Time Passes, and the same house that we were just at, where they were having dinner, is now empty. It's years later. It is sort of being ravaged by nature.
And I guess that's meant to imply that Mr. Ramsay, I guess that's supposed to say that, you know, he kind of lost concern with the summer house after the death of his wife, and then especially because we only find out briefly, and she brackets it off, right, that like 10 years has passed and that Miss Ramsay died suddenly, that Prue, I think one of their younger daughters, died, and that Andrew, their kind of star scholarship winning son, died in World War One.
Yeah.
Got like shell shrapnel and just basically died instantly.
Yeah, and Prue died in like childbirth or something.
Yeah. So everything is completely different, right? So like it completely changes the dynamic as we move into part 2 with Time Passes. We're 10 years advanced. Yeah, and then it is mostly about that house in part 2. And part 2 is very brief.
Yeah, it's just giving us an image of the house being taken by nature, sort of dilapidated, fallen apart, and then we get this caretaker. And it's these, I guess, two caretakers. They start sort of fixing it up. And they give us some backstory and tell us about, obviously all these deaths that have happened and all of the times that they didn't come to the summer house. And we get these little parentheticals where we hear about those deaths, right? That's how she uses the parentheticals here.
Yeah.
And this question of, did nature supplement what man advanced? Did she complete what he began? Oh, and this is also when we find out that Carmichael is seeing some success in his poetry now, because the war has renewed an interest in poetry.
The war renewed it.
But yeah, it just gets beaten up by the weather. It's falling apart, and then these two caretakers.
That's interesting too, dude, with like the ways that she brackets off these kind of big events. And it's a testament to her craft, I think, where we get these inner monologues, the stream of consciousness, but then the information of something that we need to know is bracketed off. I want to say almost like a screenplay or something, like a script where you're just kind of bracketing off an important piece of information. And like you just said, that Mr. Carmichael's poetry, I actually underlined that line too. The war, people said, had revived their interest in poetry. That's like bracketed off, just kind of giving us this little information, being like, okay, this is a huge part of the story, but it's also separate. And it comes at the end of like these long, like kind of small sections, shorter sections of this kind of inner monologue.
Well, that's another thing that was interesting, because like at the dinner, when everyone was so interested in talking politics, or like, half of the guests were really interested in talking about political things and half of them were clearly not. And then Carmichael is there asking for soup.
The poet, yeah.
Who like doesn't like to hang out, like he would rather just like go to his room and hang out.
Leave his
like,
candle burning.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that was funny to me. It's like, yeah, the war would renew people's interest in poetry.
Yeah. Yeah, man. And that's a very brief chapter, or a very brief section, part 2.
Yeah, and then at the very end of it, Lily Briscoe arrives.
Yeah, I put in my notes, part 3, all about Lily. And that's what I mean. So we have these kind of bookends where we have mostly Miss Ramsey in the first section. Then we have these kind of just the house itself and these kind of events that transpire that they bracket off over the last 10 years. And then we're back in the house and we're with Lily's back. And it's kind of follows Lily, not exclusively her, obviously, but just it's all, mostly the third section is Lily's inner monologue.
Yeah.
And I would say it's mostly her grappling with the Ramseys, Mr. and Mrs., even though Miss Ramsey's been dead for a long time at this point.
Well, the last piece of the second part is actually Lily Briscoe. It's the beginning of her sort of inner monologue. And it also is just like sort of a comment that I think suggests, it's that people are here that makes this place beautiful. It's that it's like, it's only beautiful if people are here, right. I guess.
Right, what makes a house beautiful, yeah.
But yeah, and the last section is it's not to the lighthouse, it's just the lighthouse. So we're finally going to the lighthouse. Mrs. Ramsey's dead.
Yeah, and I didn't underline much, but yeah, since we finally get that, like, the actual going to the lighthouse in this last section, it's like, and really they don't even, the lighthouse doesn't even come into, like, the very end here. Because most of this last section is about when we're not in Lily's head, and we're in James or, what's her name's head, though, the daughter.
Yeah, and we're getting like these compounding memories throughout this section that we're like seeing from the perspective of other characters than we originally saw them too. But James has like this rage toward his father. But oh yeah, no, there's a sad moment that I was the boots. There are the
The
boots.
boots.
And
Boots.
so there's this moment where Lily consents, like she's there, she has an interaction with Mr. Ramsey, and she consents that he wants her sympathy. I'm trying to find this line. Do you know where it is?
What chapter?
I think it's, let's see, it's close to the beginning. Oh, 153 in mine. Or I guess it starts a little bit before that. Such expeditions, said Mr. Ramsey. So it's chapter 2. Such expeditions, said Mr. Ramsey, scraping the ground with his toe, are very painful. Still Lily said nothing. She is a stock, she is a stone, he said to himself. They are very exhausting, he said, looking with a sickly look that nauseated her. He was acting, she felt. This great man was dramatizing himself. But his beautiful hands. It was horrible. It was indecent. Would they never come, she asked. For she could not sustain this enormous weight of sorrow, support these heavy draperies of grief. He had assumed a pose of extreme decrepitude. He even tottered a little as he stood there, a moment longer. She could say nothing. The whole horizon seemed swept bare of objects to talk about. Could only feel amazedly, as Mr. Ramsey stood there, how his gaze seemed to fall dolefully over the sunny grass and discolor it, and cast over the rubicund, drowsy, entirely contented figure of Mr. Carmichael, reading a French novel on a deck chair, a veil of crepe. Look at him, he seemed to be saying. Look at me. And indeed, all the time he was feeling, think of me, think of me.
What beautiful boots, she exclaimed.
Yeah. Yeah, so she's like looking for something to say, and she says, "What beautiful boots," she exclaimed. She was ashamed of herself to praise his boots when he asked her to solace his soul. When he had shown her his bleeding hands, his lacerated heart, and asked her to pity them, then to say cheerfully, "Ah, what beautiful boots you wear." And like Mr. Ramsey has like a really positive response to this. And he's like excited to talk about decent boot makers.
Yeah. Only one man in England who can make boots like that. Boots are among the chief curses of mankind, he said. Bootmakers make it their business, he exclaimed, to cripple and torture the human foot. Yeah, what's happening in this part, you know? Like, what in terms of Lily, are we getting... There's a hint that Lily is obviously softening on Mr. Ramsey. Not
Well,
quite.
because here's Mr. Ramsey without Mrs. Ramsey to praise his boots.
Yeah.
How wonderful they are. But also they're like these wonderful boots. They're like, they are to him as art is to Lily. Like this thing of beauty and joy that is like going to continue to be that for him for his life.
Well-made boots.
Yeah. Well, we get that same, like, I mean, it's the same idea that's like sort of all throughout this, like, you know, Mrs. Ramsey's ability to sort of like create like a distinct moment in time. Right. And Lily's making art, right? That's what she's looking forward to, something of permanence, but not necessarily of the world. And then, you know, for Mr. Ramsey, it's his boots.
I kept getting this weird thing when I was reading these last sections of Lily, as if like Lily was almost considering like, I don't know, I feel like there's subtle hints of Lily not just like softening on Mr. Ramsey.
Oh, she totally is.
But like there's a little bit more than that like she's kind of afraid of the fact that she might like him.
Well, right, but she also understands how sad he is now.
which is kind of what
In a
makes
way,
her like him.
yeah,
Like, yeah, like,
actually, or like feel a great actual sympathy for him that she didn't before, right? When he was asking her for it, and now she can give it freely, and he's not actually there. Because she's like thinking about it and saying, but now he had nobody to talk to about that table or his boots or his knots. And he was like a lion seeking whom he could devour, and his face had that touch of desperation, of exaggeration in it, which alarmed her. And then she recalled there was that sudden revivification, that sudden flare, when she praised his boots, that sudden recovery of vitality and interest in ordinary human things, which too passed and changed, for he was always changing and hid nothing, into that other final phase, which was new to her and had, she owned, made herself ashamed of her own irritability when it seemed as if he had shed worries and ambitions, and the hope of sympathy and the desire for praise had entered some other region, was drawn on as if by curiosity in the dumb colloquy, whether with himself or with another, at the head of that little procession out of one's range. An extraordinary face. The gate banged.
yeah. And it's really quite beautiful. Like I said, there, especially in that last section, because that last section I read kind of all at once, and like I said, I was fucking hypnotized. Like I was hypnotized, and I remember my wife came into the room at one point when I was reading like the last like 15 pages, and she kind of like interrupted me. I forget, just asking me something, and I was just like kind of like completely out of it, dude. I was completely sucked into this little like fictional world, just hypnotized by it. And it took me a second to be like, wait a minute, what did you just say? Like I I was in a
Yeah.
completely different world here, and you just came in and reminded me that like I'm in the real world. And I'm like, oh shit. I was just hypnotized. Like, and you follow Lily's thought process through, and again, like she's the major character change. I guess you get Ramsey peripherally through Lily, kind of realizing that he's changed over the 10 years, but Lily is kind of getting this catastrophic realization that she actually cared deeply for the Ramseys, particularly Miss Ramsey.
Yeah, but then she also says, oh, she's kind of out of date right now. Like, all of her ideas are kind of. And then she kind of turns to Mr. Ramsey, and it's like, oh, it's you that I want because you're actually here and alive. Or so I assume. But where's that part where she says he wore boots and tied knots or some shit? Like, it was a really good, like, short 2 sentences.
Wearing boots and tying knots.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember where it is, but my God, it just made me laugh. It was also so sad.
Dude, that, and I mean the scenes with Cam and James, especially in those last couple pages of them on the boat heading to the lighthouse, and Mr. Ramsey's reading that book.
You're talking about when?
Chapter 11 in the last section here. And I'm thinking of, because there's allusion, or there's mention before this to Cam and James, the 2 younger children, are the only ones left at home still, and they're both like 17 and 16 or something like that, or 17 and 18, and they're going on the boat. And you just get a lot of Cam's perspective that you didn't get before. And she's saying in this paragraph on page 141 in my version, she says, lest this should be wrong, she looked at him reading the little book with the shiny cover mottled like a plover's egg. No, it was right. Look at him now, she wanted to say aloud to James, but James had his eye on the sail. He is a sarcastic brute, James would say. He brings the talk round to himself and his books, James would say. He is intolerably egotistical. Worst of all, he is a tyrant. But look, she said, looking at him. Look at him now. She looked at him reading the little book with his legs curled, the little book whose yellowish pages she knew without knowing what was written on them. And yeah, it's just... there's... These things are so moving and they're so subtle,
Yeah.
but they're so moving. Like she manages to capture this kind of like this, the sister trying to get her brother's attention to be like, well, hold on a minute, like look at our father right now, like is he really what you say he is, kind of thing.
Yeah, because and James has like this vision of his father as like a terrible guy, like, and always wants to. There's all he keeps thinking about killing him. Not actually, but like keeps thinking about it, would like to kill him.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, we go back to Oedipus and all this kind of stuff, like Freud, all these people that like have hinted at this kind of the male kind of default setting here where you're constantly competing against your father and your father's father, right, kind of thing.
Well, and it's because well, and
But
like we
not,
also get
yeah,
James's perspective early on that like he's like he hated his father then too. Well, I guess really it was Mrs. Ramsey's perspective saying like, yeah, the kids all hate him. He because he's so like severe and
he's a brute,
he's incapable of just
egotistical.
having a nonsense fun time.
Bro always brings the conversation to himself in his books. Like that's what they would
Yeah.
say. Again, this is very apt description of academics, right? This
But
is a
also
very
just like wants his dad to say like I'm proud of you
right,
because
and
and
it's
then his
that
dad
too.
says that he's proud of him.
Well, he
And he
doesn't
tries
even,
not
right? It's
well he tries not to
unsaid.
show. Is it unsaid?
Well, I guess he said that's how it ends, right? The very end. I guess he says it.
Because he like and that's when like Han is looking at him being like, I know that you're just pretending not to be moved right now. Is that what all men are looking for? The approval of their fathers?
Yes.
Is that what it's about?
Well, that little scene, yes. I think
And
that's one of
then
the
Lily
things,
finishes her painting finally.
and I think that's one of the things that Woolf captures in this book. And we keep going back to this kind of, yeah, like the sexes dynamic, the male female dynamic. Huge theme because we're just getting the inner monologues. They're in the same scene, so that's a perfect way to display it. They're in the same scene, but then we have the inner monologues that are completely different, thinking about the same things, but they're completely different ways of thinking about all that kind of stuff. Like, but yeah. That too, dude. I mean, there is this level of, yeah,
And James now has the thing that his father, maybe we can assume, never got.
right.
Because, well, there's that part where
He praised
that's
Andrew all the time. He praised his son that he was most proud of, right? Like his scholarships and all that. But now Andrew's dead. Like Andrew's been dead since the war. And James, I guess, is, it's hinted that he's feeling like I'm, the only son left. Like, I guess they had 8 kids, so maybe not. But like,
yeah.
what do you want me to do for you to kind of clap me on the back type thing? Yeah, it's a huge thing, man. Huge. This is a huge theme in literature general, of course, particularly men that want this approval from their father. I mean, this is huge theme, reoccurs because it's very human, right? Like it's just a fact of kind of life in that regard. Not that, I mean, every child wants approval from their parents, obviously, but there is, I mean, there's just the same way with daughters and mothers as sons and fathers types things. Like there is that dynamic that's a little bit different. Like it's a little bit different need that is trying to be fulfilled in those relationships. And same thing, difference, right? So James got everything he needed from his mother, right? Like he loves his mother and he thinks of her fondly. Like he get his kind of flashbacks to her death is most of his perspective in the end of that book there, right? This last section. Yeah. So there is that level of it. But yeah, man, I mean, it's different. So he got this love. He got what he needed from his mother. And I think this is kind of the constant dynamic. So even Miss Ramsey and is not, you could argue, I guess, is not quite getting what she needs from her husband, and then he thinks he's not getting quite what he needs from his wife, right? Like this kind of like constant, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe it captures those insecurities that we all feel, and like at a bunch of different levels, which I guess is what makes this so beloved, such a great classic, so
Yeah, I mean,
revered.
there's even that moment at the in the dinner scene where Mrs. Ramsey, I think it's Mrs. Ramsey, maybe it's Lily, but I think it's Mrs. Ramsey is thinking about the way she sees him interacting with younger, prettier women.
Oh yes, oh yes. Like, another very real dynamic that I guess mattered more uh, back then in terms of like the sexism and the legal, like legalized sexism that was like
Yeah.
happening. But yeah, like it was literally written into law. Like fucking sexism was written into law. But yeah, that's yeah, man. I mean, it's incredible. My
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
my final question, and we may have already covered this, maybe it's a dumb question, but I kept asking myself when I finished reading this book, and I was incredibly moved by this book. It's a short book, so but it is incredibly dense. Like, it's a 150-page book for me, so I could usually read a 150-page book in like a day or two, right? I mean, it takes like an hour, couple hours to read a short book. But with this book, dude, it took me like 4 days to read this 150-page novel just because it's so dense, and I was very moved by it, and I was very like, oh my god, this is gorgeous prose, gorgeous structure, it's brilliant, genius level structure, style, all of that. But then I got to the end of it and I kept asking myself, what is this book about?
I mean, I think
It's tough, right? Like, I kept trying to think, I kept trying to, and I wrote
I
down a
mean, I think
few.
it's about the nature of being, right? We get all of this talk of like what is life, what is like who are we when we are most at ourselves and are most comfortable, right? I think it tackles all of those questions. We get what I assume is probably close to Woolf's philosophy, like is, all we have is like each other, and like you should like make these beautiful things, whatever, whether it's like these moments like Mrs. Ramsey, or um, these boots that Mr. Ramsey has, or like the works of art that Lily makes that she is certain will be forgotten, but is also seemingly adamant that you do it less so for fame, because it seems very critical of, not even critical, maybe just honest about the nature of fame and like what actually drives the desire for it.
Yeah. I
That,
I struggled for an answer. I started writing things like, okay, what would I say if I had to give this, like, sum it up in a sentence? Like, what is this about? And you go very large, you go very small. Humanity, people. You said being, right? This idea. The best thing that I found most satisfying and just like my own thinking was I wrote down the in betweens.
moments of epiphany.
Not even that, because I
Well, I
just,
mean, I read this book in the context of a modern epiphany class.
well, I mean, it is, yeah. But I just mean like uh, the in between. So like every major event, like is, and even the major deaths, right? We just get those kind of like bracketed off in like other sections. There's just like a little, and they're very short, little basically, like I said, almost screenwriting, like with just a little bit of information here that you need, bracketed off from the rest of the text, and then like yeah, the whole book is about in between those things, like what's happening in between these
Well,
things, and not just that, like what's happening in between two people when they're sitting at dinner and there's a lull of silence all of a sudden, like what is happening, like these little in between moments that are so brief and fluttering, but they are also so vital and important to like kind of understanding the situation, the dynamic, uh, anything, I don't know. That's
yeah.
the best
I
answer I
mean,
come
I
up with.
think you know how I feel about like just trying to so easily sort of in a sentence say what something is about. But yeah, I mean, you could call it like a portrait of like, like a family or a domestic portrait, but also I think that would be kind of narrow.
Right.
I think it is broader. I think it is like a portrait of internal life within a like yeah, I mean, I guess that's what it is.
That's what I mean. And I
But
don't mean
like
like, yeah, like obviously we've talked about this all the time on the podcast, but it's like, okay, like it doesn't necessarily have to have, about when I say what it's about, I don't mean, oh, it's about this guy, like plot points, like, oh, this one
yeah.
guy. I mean, like, what's it saying? Like, what the fuck is this
Well, yeah,
trying to
that's what I mean.
say
I think
or
I think it's
successfully
hard
saying?
to
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's hard. And this is another argument that we can have at another time because we've argued about this plenty, I think, about whether something has to have like a single sentence that you could say, this is clearly what this is about. Because I think things are typically more complicated than that. That's why I think we have themes like it's about the male female dynamic. It's about like, especially within the house, and it's about, these deep, rich inner lives that never actually
Get articulated,
but like are known to
right.
some degree or aren't known, or the ways that we know people, like which we really get with Lily Bosco, who explains like, yeah, you make up these stories in your head about the lives of people, and we call this knowing people. Like, and it's true like that, and it's just so poignantly said at every turn. It's about how much do we know of one another, really? How much do we know of ourselves that we don't say out loud?
Right. Manners,
Yeah.
customs, like all this kind of, it's very dense. Yeah, that's what I mean. And it's
But I
so
would say it's not even like, I would say like manners and customs. I think of like Edith Wharton, but I think with Virginia Woolf, like there is that, but I think it's so much more about the inner lives than it is about like what happens around a given custom. Like, yeah, we get dinner, right? But like we don't get like, we only get glimpses of those things, like the after dinner drawing room talk and like all of these other small things, or like Mrs. Ramsey. Like there are things that are like ritual, I would say maybe more.
right. And the reason I bring that up is, yes, a ritual, I would call that just, politeness, manners that we use. You don't say what you're thinking in your head when you're talking to somebody in polite conversation type thing, right? But in this
Right.
novel, we get all of that. Like, we get everything that
Great.
nobody's saying. So it's like this, it's about these in between spaces, like these, and I get that's vague, like it doesn't really nail down what it is, but it's also because this book is so dense. Yeah. So I don't know. That was
Yeah.
just, I kept racking my
Yeah, no.
brain.
I think it's great. I love it. I also think it's about like the nature of thought.
Yeah, you just have to fucking read it, listeners. You
Yeah,
just have to fucking read it.
it's gorgeous. It's beautiful. We get this whole little like snippet at the end that like I said, I think is maybe like where like Lily, um, what's her name?
Lily Briscoe?
Briscoe. I feel like I keep calling her the wrong name. I feel like I've called her Lily Bosco.
Lily is a
The fuck?
very, like the chocolate. No, like, yeah, like Lily is a very, very popular female name, I guess, in novels at this time. I'm thinking of like all the Edith Wharton novel we read, and then, whatever. I guess it's just a
Yeah,
common.
but anyway, I probably fucked that up a bunch of times while we were having this conversation.
Lily
Um,
Bosco. She's heir to a chocolate empire. No.
oh, but what is the meaning of life? That was all. A simple question, one that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one, this, that, and the other. Herself and Charles Tansley, and the other, and the breaking wave, Mrs. Ramsay bringing them together, Mrs. Ramsay saying, life stands still here. Mrs. Ramsay making of the moment something permanent. As in another sphere, Lily herself tried to make of the moment something permanent. This was the nature of a revelation.
I think you just nailed it, dude. The line that I would say nails it the most. Matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. So, like, oh, what's this novel about? This novel's about matches struck unexpectedly in the dark, like little miracles.
The nature of revelation. That's
Yeah.
like what she's calling it,
Right.
right?
Yeah. I just like that
In the
description better.
yeah.
Yeah.
In the midst of chaos, there was shape, this eternal passing and flowing. She looked at the clouds going and the leaves shaking. We get a lot of leaves, by the way. A lot of leaves and a lot of waves and a lot of water-related language.
Coast of England, man. I mean, not to mention, yeah, I mean,
There was
England.
shape. Life stands still here, Mrs. Ramsay said. Mrs. Ramsay, she repeated. She owed it all to her.
Yeah, man. I mean, you know, all those fucking England is fucking wet as shit. Like, it's an island, and then it just fucking rains all the time. It's wet as shit, dude. Leaves, water.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what this book is about. If I had to point to one of many, I mean, I think there are a bunch of sections where you could point to like what this book is about, but I would say that's a good one to go to.
Yeah, man. Great fucking read. Buy the book, read it. Stop pretending that you've read it. Read the book. And join the convo. Join Heavy Board on Patreon. Patreon.com/heavyboard. Anything else on this, or are we done?
I'm thinking.
Alright, that probably means we're done.
Means we're done.
Yeah. I mean, we hit almost 2 hours here. We'll cut it down.
Yeah.
Anything else you wanted to mention, say, before we wrap up, or buy the book? Buy this fucking book. Read
I gotta
it.
really
Read it
make
and
a
be
temperature adjustment over here because I'm like sweating like a fucking pig.
yeah. Read it and watch matches be struck unexpectedly in the dark. It is. You have to read it too. Like, it's hard. Like, I'm struggling to we're struggling to describe it. Like, you have to read it. Like, if you haven't read Virginia Woolf, go buy this book right now. Click the link in the description of this podcast and fucking buy it. Spend a couple days with it, and you won't regret it. That's my sign-off message. Yeah.
I'm Sophie Weiner, and my heater is permanently stuck in the on position.
Is it cold there?
Yep.
Yeah, how cold is it?
Winter, bitch.
Yeah, dude, I live in places that don't really have winter. The last 6 years I've lived in places that don't get those temperatures, like in Maryland.
Yeah, it's winter as shit here right now.
I like not having winter, actually. I've grown accustomed to it, living in the South and now living in the Southwest. And so, yeah, I like not having snow. I like it not getting colder than 50 degrees ever. Wouldn't do well.
50 is a good temperature.
Yeah,
It's a confusing temperature sometimes, though. Not always sure how to dress for 50. Kind of pisses me off.
It is, yeah. You need a specific type of jacket. The British have kind of accomplished this. If you look at some of the British jackets, they're kind of nice. Like the hunting coats that are meant for fall weather. Anyway, that's just my. Anyway, yeah. All right, we're done with Virginia Woolf. Good read. Buy the book. Reminders. We're looking for workshop horror stories. If you have a good workshop horror story that was give everybody a laugh, we'd love to commiserate with you. Send your workshop horror story to heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Reminder for listeners, if you're a Patreon subscriber, your email automatically gets prioritized. You get priority access to us in that regard. So if you're like, oh, why aren't we looking at your email? Why aren't we reading your workshop horror story? It's like, well, if you pay us, we prioritize your story. Okay, we'll put that on there. But yeah, so send your workshop horror story to heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/heavyboard. You receive full uncensored episodes for subscribers. If you're cheap, check out our YouTube channels. We'll post free episodes and clips up there as well. All the links to the books and shit, both versions that we read this week, are linked in the description. And next episode, we are doing Ben Lerner's The Art of Reading. No, fuck. Next week, we are doing Ben Lerner's The Hatred of Poetry.
Oof.
I've never read it.
Well,
That's gonna be fun, dude. That's gonna be a lot of
I
fun.
guess you're in for a treat.
Oh, you've read it?
Mm-hmm.
Damn. You don't seem excited.
Don't I?
Yeah, I'm very excited for it, so it'll be a good conversation. Maybe not. Maybe us doing his book, he'll come on and do an interview, dude.
I don't know about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so anyway, next week we're doing, Ben Lerner's The Hatred of Poetry, which is fitting because I hate it right now, so we're going to see what happens.
Yeah.
Also, if you can get us a Metamucil sponsorship, bidet sponsorship, TP, anything related to dumping or hygiene with your butthole, we will. We want a scholarship. We want a sponsorship. Scholarship. I got the Metamucil. Metamucil scholarship, dude. I'm going for free.
They should put out a scholarship.
Yeah, dude. We can start one, dude. We'll start the Heavy Board Foundation. Brought to you by Metamucil.
Scholarship.
Yeah, dude.
I'd be proud of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been Heavy Board. I'm Andrew Whitstadt.
Yeah, I already said my name.
I guess we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I
Heavy.
should say.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.